For a period of time, I dated a girl who was apprenticing as a funeral director and embalmer. Part of her scope also included preparing funeral documents, such as graphics, photo rolls, and guest books. We had plans to hang out one night, but she was working late and particularly stressed about a service she was preparing. So I surprised her at the funeral home with a pizza. She was the only one working in the building that night. We went into the upstairs office to enjoy our pizza, and then I was going to leave to let her get back to it. As we were eating, she mentioned that the person she was preparing was very adamant they did not want a service or memorial, but the family was pushing for one anyway. She was having a lot of trouble getting the documents together, with things not saving or printing correctly, files getting corrupted, etc., which was unusual since she'd done this work a lot before, and she was pretty stressed about it. When I came downstairs to leave, all the lights in the funeral home were on, which was pretty weird. Did we turn them on and forget? Did someone come into the building? Since she was alone, we figured we'd do a walkthrough of the building just to make sure no one had entered the building. We both had this uneasy feeling, and room by room, we swept the building to make sure no one was there and turned off the lights. Literally every single light was on, even closets and such, and that was very weird. The last area was in the back and included the crematorium, the embalming/prep room, a storage area for materials, and a loading dock. You didn't have a clear line of sight from the doorway. In front of you was the material storage with the loading dock around the corner out of sight from the door, the embalming rooms to the left, and the crematorium adjacent to that. The body of the person who did not want this service was in the prep room. I cleared the storage area and then walked with her to the embalming rooms and stood by the door while my girlfriend went into the embalming room to check it. The second she turned off the lights in the room where the body was kept, a radio at full volume turned on in the loading dock. I was so uneasy and the sound was so unexpected I almost shit my pants. I ran to turn off the radio and clear the loading dock, and no one was there. We turned off the rest of the lights, and I got the heck out of there, while she stayed behind to finish her work for another hour or two. That night, my girlfriend firmly believed the spirit of the person who did not want the service performed was there that night, and the source of the lights, the radio, and her troubles with building the document package. I don't really believe in spiritual things or ghosts or anything like that, but I have no other way to explain what happened that night. It was freaking weird, and still creeps me out when I think about it. We got the corpse of a man into the body bag so crime scene investigators could take their photos. In the nearby toilet, we discovered more blood, possibly up to a third of the gentleman's entire blood volume. Around that exact moment, another patrol officer, who was searching the residence, started to find random objects covered in fecal matter. Eventually, he found more objects with a mix of fecal matter and blood. It then hit us exactly what we were dealing with: extreme violent sodomy with foreign objects. Most of the objects were somewhat reasonable, I suppose smaller objects resembling a phallic shape like TV remotes. However, 3 objects stood out and are what make this story truly unsettling. The first was a broom. While you might think it's skinny and not too bad, the depth to which it was inserted suggested a bowel perforation. The second object of note was a baseball bat, the contact end of it, which was significantly wider in girth and inserted deeply. The final and most standout object was a guitar, a really nice Stratocaster. The tuning end of the guitar was covered in a thick paste of fecal matter and blood. This man had been sodomized to death. At autopsy, the findings were obvious. However, what I had to do is something I'll never forget. After the primary evisceration was complete, the doctor wanted to completely excise the rectum. So, I had to don a chainmail glove and, after rolling this poor guy onto his side, press inside his abdominal cavity to push his rectum out towards his anus so the doctor could pull it taut enough to cut out. After she had the guy's rectum out, which resembled one of those jelly-filled toys that fall inside themselves when you hold them, my fellow 80s/90s babies should recall these toys. We then cut lengthwise up it to unfold the rectal tissue into a large rectangle to see the extent of the internal lacerations. Needless to say, they were deep, extensive, and numerous. The assailants have been apprehended. So that's the story of how I had to cut out a guy's rectum for science, medicine, and law. There was a call about a man acting extremely erratically. He had no known history of drug abuse and no diagnosed psychiatric illnesses. His mother, whom he lived with, along with many of the neighbors, called 911 multiple times, but first responders were allegedly taking their time getting to the scene. He lured his mother out into the hallway, then ran back into the apartment alone and locked the door behind him. He ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, turned the shower on, and castrated himself. He then stuffed his severed genitals into his mouth and down his throat before slitting his own throat. He was picked up by EMS and brought to a local hospital where he was pronounced DOA due to his injuries. No preliminary toxicology was conducted by the hospital. His remains were then picked up by us for examination. Unfortunately, this happened during my last days of work, after I had already put in my 2 weeks' notice, so I don't have access to the postmortem toxicology report to determine why he did it. If the tox report is negative for illicit substances, we may never know why he did it. My personal hypothesis is that he suffered from some form of developmental disorder combined with a latent psychiatric illness. Compounded with unresolved body or gender dysmorphia, he was unable to cope with his feelings and had a psychotic break. I work as a motor vehicle collision analyst. We get called to fatal vehicle collisions to reconstruct what happened and determine the cause of the collision. We provide analysis and expert testimony in court. I've seen many deceased persons and animals, and I've witnessed almost every wretched way a human can die in a collision. However, there is one incident that stays with me every fall. In late October, I was called out to a fatal single-vehicle incident. The driver was traveling through a shallow S-curve at high speed. She was unable to negotiate the first turn, and her vehicle reached critical velocity. The wheels on the passenger side buckled, and the vehicle rolled. She was not wearing her seatbelt, and during the first roll, she was partially ejected through the driver's side window. Her skull was crushed between the outside of the door and the road, and it continued to flop partially out of the window as the vehicle rolled. Her skull was split from her left eye to the rear right behind her ear, causing her brain matter to be strewn about the road and car. Her body was eventually thrown from the vehicle and came to rest on the side of the road. One aspect of the job requires inspecting bodies for evidence. I approached her body, which was lying on its back. The skull was very open, and I could clearly see the inside cavity with no brain. The brain was deposited in chunks on the road, emitting a distinct smell. This scene didn't bother me at the time. I was more fascinated than anything. A few hours later, I got a call from my wife, just asking how the day was going. I told her I was on scene and couldn't talk long. She then asked if I would be working late or be home on time because we were supposed to carve pumpkins with the kids that night. Years later, I still can't carve pumpkins, and the kids have no idea why. I watched 2 young children's corpses fry with electricity. We responded to an electrocution call. A fault caused electricity to travel down the stabilizing cables of an electrical pole. A little kid touched that cable and got shocked, causing his hand to grasp tighter. His little buddy must have seen it and grabbed him. By the time we arrived, they were both dead but still electrified. We couldn't safely approach until the electricity department cut the power. So we sat there and watched these 2 little bodies twitch and spark. It was like a horror movie. Before COVID, I worked at a funeral home that wasn't particularly well run. I was a funeral assistant, and one of the embalmers, AJ, was notoriously difficult to deal with. About 4 days before this story, AJ had picked up a deceased man who had died of septicemia. He was to be cremated because he was already in a bad state upon death. AJ had the brilliant idea to leave this gentleman on the rolling cot for 4 days unrefrigerated, figuring it wouldn't matter since he was being cremated and it was a slow week. Of course, I got the job of moving him to the crematory with AJ. We walked into the embalming room and found that the decedent had bloated and was leaking a gray liquid sludge out of his urinary catheter onto the floor. If pestilence had a smell, it would have been this liquid. To describe this liquid as smelling bad is an understatement. The liquid was something you could feel and sense in the air. AJ and I donned our gear. Luckily, since she placed him on a cot already, we didn't have to do much in terms of moving the body. Unluckily, the cot was relatively old, and one of the cot wheels had to be manually unlocked using hands. as the foot pedal was too rusted to effectively use. AJ told me to unlock it, so I carefully bent down and unlocked the wheel. Well, AJ got the bright idea to shake the cot violently as some sort of prank, sending the gray liquid over the edge directly onto the top of my head, dripping down under my eye protection and mask. I closed my lips and eyes so the liquid running over them would stay out of my body, and I calmly walked to the employee bathroom in a sort of numb state of shock. The funeral home owners saw my sludgy appearance and sent me home, paid for the rest of the day. I worked at a mortuary for a few years. We have methods to keep the jaw shut for viewing. Otherwise, it would gape open due to the angle of the head and neck. During a viewing, the device failed, and this gentleman's mouth literally popped open. The lead embalmer was not on site, so I did my best. I ushered the family out of the room and tried to superglue his mouth shut. However, he didn't have teeth, and supergluing just his lips did not work. It looked as if he was attempting to scream. I had to call one of our other mortuaries in town, and their embalmer came over. He used a giant needle and thread to sew the gentleman's mouth shut from under his chin to his palate. The creepiest thing I've ever experienced was the curtain of flies and maggots blanketing the floor of an apartment where a woman had been decomposing in the hot late August sun for 3 weeks before she was discovered. I thought that it was just dark in that apartment, but it was because there were many flies caught in the glass covering the light bulbs on the ceiling, on the floor lamp, and on the light on top of the stove. Every single light was covered in flies. The windows were dark because it was covered with flies. Dead flies and even more flies on the window panes. It was like a horror movie. She melted into the couch. When we tried to pick her up, her spine just fell out of the rest of her body, and she ended up in pieces. I guess it's less creepy and more skin-crawling, but I hate flies and maggots. Freshly dead, I can deal with it. Decomposition itself is fine. But the sight of those flies made me want to throw up. I'm pretty sure I threw out the clothes I wore that day. My grandpa had a creepy experience in Vietnam. He was helping wash and prepare bodies for transport home under the direction of the coroner, who had warned them about the bodies making noises when moved. After a while, Grandpa asked the coroner how the body he was washing could cry. The coroner repeated the lecture about air being pushed out, but Grandpa persisted, asking how tears could form. According to him, things got very busy after that. As it turned out, Grandpa's assigned corpse was not actually dead, just suffering from a lot of blood loss and extreme cold. The man received 5 liters of blood transfusion, some of it from my grandpa, and then he flew home to spend the rest of the war recovering. I delivered pizza to a crematorium one day. The guy receiving the pizza set it down on a cardboard coffin while he went to get money, and I couldn't help but keep glancing at the box on the conveyor leading into the crematorium chamber. Finally, I couldn't hold back and blurted out, "Isn't that a little disrespectful?" The guy returned and simply replied, "Oh, don't worry about him, he won't mind." This was a strange one. 2 brothers lived in a would-be condemned house, both severely intellectually challenged, one more so than the other. This was the most repulsive living situation I have ever personally seen. Black mold everywhere, the ceiling caving in, everything covered in crumbling drywall and water damage. Ironically, they had no running water. The only clean things in the house were 2 pallets of baked beans and Coca-Cola. They only ate beans and only drank Coke by the pallet. We went upstairs to the deceased brother's room and found him lodged between the bed and the wall. This isn't uncommon for someone who dies suddenly in bed. However, what we found all over the floors was horrifying. The bedroom looked like a typical hoarder's place, with newspapers and rank junk piled up beyond your knees. But there was more. Women's underwear was strewn across the floor, each pair covered in fecal matter. Additionally, there were guns everywhere. Not nice guns either, but old, decrepit, rusted-out ones. The entire house was filled with them, hundreds of unusable guns. The ATF had to come clear the scene and document them all. It was insanity. Despite all this, the autopsy was completely unremarkable. This story was fairly unremarkable overall, except for the fact that the face of the corpse had been eaten off by a wild animal overnight. This poor soul was riding his bike through a field of cranberry bogs when he suddenly died. By morning, his face had been eaten off by a wild animal. He looked like the Terminator. Some musculature remained, as did one of his eyes, but his lips, cheeks, and soft bits were gone. Upon my arrival, a small swarm of yellow jackets had taken to the man's face, eating and laying eggs in it. We had to bug bomb the body bag before opening it to make sure the wasps didn't get into the morgue. I used to be a med lab tech in the Army and sometimes assisted with autopsies in the hospital. We did one on an infantryman from Fort Carson, 4th ID, who had committed suicide by shooting himself in the right temple. The round passed under his frontal lobe and just behind his eyes, barely skimming his brain. The pathologist estimated that it took several minutes for him to die, as the location of the wound caused him to bleed out rather than killing him instantly. The creepy part was that, because the round passed just behind his eyes and wasn't a hollow point that would spread out, it severed the back of his eyes, causing them to drain. His eyes looked deflated and glossy, as dead eyes do. It was a weird and sad sight. My first job was at a cemetery. We had a common burial for someone who couldn't afford a casket or vault. They were provided with a wood frame and a cardboard casket. We dug the hole the night before, but it rained heavily that night. The next day, after the ceremony, we lowered the casket into the water-filled hole. It floated on top of the water. We used a backhoe bucket to push it down, but the casket fell apart and the body slid out and floated to the surface. We had to push her down and fill the hole. I protested, but was told this was how things were done. I still feel bad about it. My creepiest moment was when I was in the morgue by myself at 4 a.m. I was using the lift to put a body into a crypt. It had reached roughly eye level when the power went out. Suddenly, it was pitch dark. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Then all the fans died, and all I could hear was the crinkling of body bags. That's when I started to hear disembodied voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying or where they were coming from. After a few moments, the power came back on, and I moved on with my night. Turns out, the voices were just the automated "the power has gone out," switching to generator power message. A friend once told me this story ages ago, and I hope I remember it well enough. When he was 18, he worked for a single-plane transport contractor, and one time they had to carry a body. It wasn't autopsied or prepared for a funeral yet. That was where they were taking it. So it was wrapped and just sort of lying on the floor. Now, when you're in the air, I'm sure other pilots will tell you the rise and fall of the airplane will do strange things with gravity, air pressure, and necromancy. In any case, the corpse had enough air in its lungs that the lower pressure outside the body caused the air inside to be expelled slowly, through the larynx. Meanwhile, the rise and fall of the plane caused the body to sit up and the wrapping to fall away. Sitting up caused it to expel more air from the lungs. So while flying a dead body in the plane, they heard a long, low moan and saw a dead body sit up in the back of the plane. The pilot panicked, left the controls, and ran back and punched the corpse across the face, knocking it back down. He told me about how they figured out what happened, but I was laughing too hard at that point to really pick up the details. I do remember that they had to explain the additional damage to the corpse when they arrived at their destination. Back in the day, I used to work for a funeral home, and often, when an elderly client with pre-arrangements passed away, I would be dispatched to collect their earthly remains and bring them back to the funeral home for preparation for their celebration of life or going-away party. This is after there is no suspected foul play. Sometimes this would involve collecting directly from the morgue or from their residence. More often than not, this happened in the middle of the night, as I was on call from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. Well, one night, I was dispatched to collect an elderly gentleman who had crossed the Rainbow Bridge and was to be picked up around 1 a.m. By the time I got ready and reached the residence, it was around 2 a.m., and back to the funeral home around 3 a.m. Once I helped Mr. Doe get comfortable in our cooler, I was ready to leave. Just as I was getting ready to set the alarm and head back home, The prep room door behind me flung open and then slammed shut very abruptly. This door is very big, very heavy, and takes some power to open and close. Needless to say, I was early for my normal shift in the morning because, well, I didn't go back to sleep. The creepiest thing about it is that just before that happened, the hair rose on the back of my neck. As an ER nurse, I've had my share of eerie experiences, but one that still gives me chills happened when we had a patient die and no one came to claim the body, so it was sent to the morgue. However, their phone was left behind in the ER by accident. Every day at 2:30 p.m., like clockwork, an alarm would go off on that phone. We couldn't turn off the alarm or shut down the phone without a passcode, and the battery seemed to last forever. Despite locking it away in the med room, the alarm still echoed through the halls, a constant reminder of the deceased. For a week, we had to endure the haunting sound of that dead person's alarm ringing at the same time every day. Even now, whenever I hear a similar ringtone, it sends shivers down my spine. My brother used to work as a mortician and once shared a chilling experience with me. He was in one part of the building, a funeral home, when he suddenly heard faint screaming. Concerned, he rushed to the front doors to see if anyone was there, but found no one calling for help. Puzzled, he returned to work, only to hear the screams again. This time, he said it sounded like two men and a woman. Determined to find the source, he searched the building but couldn't locate where the sounds were coming from. Then, he checked the body prep room, where he heard the screams just behind the door. To his shock, he discovered two males and one female laying on their prep tables. It was undoubtedly the creepiest thing he had ever experienced, or at least based on what he told me. During my college years, I worked for a pathologist. I've handled every imaginable part of the human body, from brains to heads, from nipples to prostates, and even some bizarre tumors. You name it, I've packaged it for shipment via FedEx. Working in the lab, I've witnessed some truly insane mishaps. Limbs, torsos, and more have gone missing for days on end, until the telltale smell eventually gave away their location. Unfortunately, the logistics of running the operation were often strained due to understaffing, leading to breakdowns in the process. Autopsies were a routine part of my job. While I grew somewhat desensitized to it all, the sight of stillborn fetuses and very young individuals always left an emotional mark on me. Watching shows like those about Dahmer, who reveled in such horrors, made me sick to my stomach, especially knowing firsthand what he handled and apparently found arousing. It's a bizarre and disturbing reality to contemplate. Now older and more grounded in the field of behavioral health, I find myself reflecting on these experiences. Beyond the lab, I've also ventured into every corner of the hospital, from the OR to the ER, from the ICU to the NICU, and everywhere in between. Strange and chaotic occurrences were par for the course in these environments. And yes, amidst it all, there was the scandalous backdrop of co-workers engaging in trysts all over the hospital, from the basements to who knows where else. While it may not have been as dramatic as Grey's Anatomy, the hospital-based soap operas certainly had some basis in reality. Scrubs probably came closer to capturing the essence of my experience. Working in a hospital nestled in a small town near a bustling university, the demographics often led to some interesting interactions. Working in a medical examiner's office was an eye-opening experience, to say the least. Amidst the solemnity of the autopsy room, two unforgettable encounters left an indelible mark on my memory. The first was observing the autopsy of a woman in her 40s, who carried considerable weight. As the pathologist saw nod through her unusually thick skull, it was apparent that her physicality posed a challenge even in death. The methodical peeling of her facial tissue, revealing the intricate anatomy beneath, was a surreal sight that lingered in my mind long after. With each incision and examination, the meticulous process of weighing organs unfolded, leading to the discovery of a large, fatal blood clot within her heart. Holding the tiny clot in my hand, no larger than a ballpoint pen tip, I was struck by the sobering realization of how something so minuscule could extinguish a life. The second encounter was far more visceral and unsettling. The body of a young man in his 20s, left exposed to the elements for several days, presented a ghastly tableau of decay. Half of his bloated, greenish form bore witness to the relentless march of decomposition. The stench that emanated from his remains defied description, evoking memories of the swamps of Dagoba tale recounted in hushed tones among medical circles. Despite the overwhelming odor, the examination pressed on, revealing little outward indication of the cause of death beyond the telltale signs of drug overdose. However, it was the final, gut-wrenching image of a swab being forcefully inserted into the deceased's urethra that seared itself into my consciousness, a grim reminder of the unyielding demands of forensic investigation, even in the face of death's repugnant embrace. In the late 80s, during a forensic dentistry class, I found myself witnessing a scene straight out of a surreal thriller. The setting was a dimly lit autopsy room in New Orleans, where an older pathologist, her gray hair neatly swept into a bun, presided over the examination of a murder victim. What struck me as particularly unnerving was the pathologist's steadfast refusal to wear gloves, even in the midst of the HIV/AIDS crisis. With a nonchalant air, she declared that she had never used them, an assertion that seemed inconceivable given the risks inherent in her line of work. The victim, a casualty of a gunshot wound, had met his end under mysterious circumstances. Knocking on the door of a dubious abode in a sketchy neighborhood, he had succumbed to death's embrace before the startled homeowner could even respond. Assisting the pathologist was James, a figure clad in a leather butcher apron, his gloved hands a stark contrast to the bare ones of his superior. As the examination delved deeper into the thoracic cavity, the pathologist plunged her ungloved hands into the congealed pool of blood within, her fingers deftly probing for the elusive bullet. With each squeeze, she muttered to her assistant, "Gotta find that bullet, James," while crimson rivulets traced intricate patterns up her forearms. In a surreal twist, I glanced over to the corner of the room to find James casually puffing on a cigarette, his gloved hands stained with the victim's lifeblood. It was a scene straight out of a macabre film. During my time with a major funeral care provider in the UK, I encountered numerous accounts of paranormal experiences among the staff at the mortuaries I visited, particularly during my time in Scotland. One particularly eerie incident, recounted by the manager, involved an elderly gentleman who had passed away and was brought in for embalming before his funeral. He remained in the mortuary for roughly 2 weeks to a month, awaiting preparations for his service. Late one night, when most of the staff had left but a skeleton crew remained on duty, as the facility operated around the clock due to the nature of its services, security footage captured the elderly man seemingly taking a stroll around the premises before mysteriously vanishing. An alarm, which should not have been triggered, went off during this time. When the remaining staff investigated, they confirmed the unsettling sight on the security footage: the deceased gentleman, who was still in the refrigerated unit. To this day, no satisfactory explanation has been found for this occurrence. Furthermore, the manager mentioned that it was not uncommon for alarms to be triggered at the funeral homes during the night, as if someone were wandering around the premises. This necessitated the contracted security firm to contact the company for assistance in turning off the alarms. However, upon investigation, no one would be found on the premises. I worked at a funeral home for quite a while. When I first started, about a month in, I was working a holiday weekend. The only people working were the transport guys and me. They dropped off a body and went right back out. Later, I thought they were still there and needed to ask a question. I walked into the embalming area, and to my horror, this dude was sitting up on the gurney, looking right at me when I opened the door. It literally made me pee a little in fright. It turned out the transport guys had picked up the body from an area hospital. He had passed away while in a slightly reclining position, and rigor mortis had set in, so they couldn't flatten him out. Still the scariest moment in my career, even if I got a laugh out of it later. Here is a funny story from my grandma. She used to work in an ER in Puerto Rico. One day, a man had passed away, and the doctor asked her to prepare the body to go to the morgue. So, she got some sheets and started to wrap him up. As she crossed his legs, suddenly his penis became fully erect and stood straight up. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but it forced her to redo the sheets. When she uncrossed his legs, the penis went down. Determined to get this over with, she crossed them again, and lo and behold, the penis went straight back up. After trying one more time, she got freaked out and went back to the doctor. The doctor found this hilarious, explaining that the man had a prosthetic in his penis.